Uh, First of all, let me deal with the idea of nostalgia. Nostalgia tends to be, people tend to think of nostalgia as sort of longing for a past, right? Longing for a past, and not just any past, but a past that is imagined or romanticized as the place to be. So we were just talking about, if you were watching television last night, you would have saw a documentary on Bukit Ho Swee fire. Now, there's nothing to be nostalgic about Bukit Ho Swee fire because it was a disaster. And so you see is people running away from the flames. And so it's not just any past that is that people are nostalgic about. And given that all pasts are fairly complex, the past of nostalgia tends to be very selective memories of what really was going on. I mean, in fact, there are people who talk about Bukit Ho Swee romantically. I lived in Bukit Ho Swee. My house was burned down. So I saw all those fires. But people, whenever people talk about kampongs, they have this image of the kampong is the most sort of nostalgic trope that actually get used all the time. And the Singapore government uses the term kampong spirit all the time, in spite of my continuous effort to denounce the term. The HDB is not a vertical kampong, right? Because the condition for a kampong to exist is long gone. To have the kind of opportunity to idle together in order to have that kind of intense community, you would have to have a population that is largely underemployed or unemployed. Now what you have is a population that don't even know when to go home from the office. So how are you going to get kampong spirits, no matter what kind of architectural environment that you have? So nostalgia is a very particular kind of memory. It's not just simple memory, it's a memory. And the tendency nostalgia, as I've said elsewhere in my writing, that nostalgia really has to do with, much more to do, not really with the past, but with the unhappiness with the present. Okay, so if part of the sort of nostalgia for the past has to do with the kind of life that you're living in the present that is not satisfactory. And to a certain extent, it's kind of like imagination of the kampong spirit as laid back, life was relaxed, rather than rushing around right now, like life in the present. I mean, yeah, life was laid back because you have no money and nowhere to go. But now you have too much money and then you can't sit still. So, I mean, and then now you got to work until 9 o'clock every night. So the complaint, so really this imagination of this relaxed life of the 50s and 60s before the HDB came on, has to do with really unhappiness about the present. And I think if you sort of skip to some of the films that I'm trying to recall, what is the most nostalgic film? In Singapore, because the Singapore history really, especially for those of you who were not British subjects like I was, your history started with probably 1959, maybe a little bit earlier, around sort of 1954 or something. Or, if you're Chinese educated, maybe the Chinese middle school sort of rebelliousness. But generally, it's a kind of Lee Kuan Yew story, right? I mean, the PAP beat the communists, and from then on, everything is wonderful, including the wealth and prosperity you now enjoy, blah, blah. But that story died with Lee Kuan Yew. So I don't think it will be invoked with the same kind of moral authority and effect anymore. So I was thinking like Singapore, nostalgic Singapore, there are very few sort of nostalgia about the colonial days, with the exception of kampongs. But kampongs was never associated with colony. It was so if you take away the colonial days, we're talking about 1960s, 1958 maybe, or if you're really political, Operation Cold Store from 63 to now. But there's very little to be nostalgic about. So I was thinking, and so in terms of the films that have been made, the one that really comes to, I mean, we were just saying Royston has made a lot of very sort of nostalgic films, but the history is extremely short. I mean, the one, one of the most sort of nostalgic one was the Old Man and the Sea in the sort of Chinese boat going down Singapore River, and he's talking in Hokkien, fairly poetically. It's fairly, actually, quite very literal Hokkien, which you seldom hear. And then another one was most recently. I mean, so the other one I was thinking of is The Great World by Kevin Tong. And again, if you see that, I mean, there was a really interesting construction of Singapore in that movie, right? It was, if you have seen it, it was the evening where Singapore was going to be bombed by the Japanese without any sort of prior notice. So this was like a wedding banquet in the Great World in Spring Court, Yong Chun Yai, which is actually currently still operating in Upper Cross Street. And it used to be a really huge restaurant in the Great World. And so there's a wedding banquet going on, but the interesting thing is not so much in the wedding banquet, but in the kitchen where several different dialects were continuously being spoken, because the maitre d' woman and the cook and all, and the assistants and all, they all spoke different dialects. But in the end, the whole movie rounded up with happily, because this very miserly father, whose son was getting married, has tried to keep the cost down as much as possible. But because the war was coming, the kitchen basically used all the best food and then just serve it. So everybody was happy. So that was that was the last very nostalgic film I saw until, I guess, about a month ago. And this is a really weird sort of idea about nostalgia now. About a month ago, or maybe 6 weeks, there was a made-for-television movie by Eric Koo on hawkers. And actually, the film is really about a bunch of, he just moved from one hawker, this Ko Bun Bin character, from 12 Story. He moved from one young hawker to another, basically trying to show that the hawker's trade are not dead, because he keep interviewing young hawkers who are taking over from their fathers to continue in selling hawker food, largely in kopitiam, right? It's really straight. It's really kind of interesting because it's really about the present, but the sentiment is really nostalgic. And then the background, the backstory of that was that he was a food critic writing this book about Singapore street food in honor of his father, because his father was a hawker. And at the end, typical Eric Koo, who's in love with death, the father actually was a ghost. You didn't know it until the very end, when the film was ended. He presented the book, and then he presented the book and said, "This is for you," and he was talking to nobody. But all through the film, the father was a figure who keeps speaking. So again, I mean, there is this kind of nostalgic elements built into something that is really about the present. And again, there is like, this increasingly this deep fear in the public sphere that we are going to lose our hawkers, and we're going to lose an identity of Singapore because hawkers' food is going to die, right? So this whole sort of attempt to recuperate that, that trade as a way of stemming off this fear of the present and the future. So this kind of fear of present and future, in some ironic way, give that whole sort of preservation of the past, right? A certain urgency that is in this film. So in spite of it being about the present, it really is very nostalgic. And even the whole feeling of the whole talk about it is always about my father's business, I have to carry on, and this kind of stuff.